what is it that you're defending? What is it that's the West, let's say, that whose loss you're decrying? Like what's at the bottom of this that we're in such radical danger of losing? This is exactly what Dawkins was pointing to, however implicitly, when he described himself as a cultural Christian. It's like, okay, the West is under assault. Well, what is it that's worth defending precisely? And how do you conceptualize that and make it explicit? And so, I mean, when I go to Europe, what do I love about Europe? The great beauty of its artistic tradition. That's something that if you have any sense, and any aesthetic sense at all, that drops you to your knees. To go to Italy, to a town like Florence, and to go into a random church where there's a painting that, if sold, would be worth $500 million, and to see it just hanging on the wall, unguarded, with no one around. Well, what is that? That's an indication of two types of treasure. One, the art itself. Two, the fact that that art can just sit there without having 100 men with machine guns around it, making sure that no thug comes along and purloins it. So that's the treasure of that implicit trust that you described. So there's the beauty, there's the deep sense of voluntary civilization that characterizes Europe. Right, there's a remarkable history of valuation of the individual all the way down the economic framework that's particularly present in the UK, probably. It's there in the Netherlands as well. There's other European countries that share that. This is not no civilization and no culture. And then, so what is it that we should be promoting and fighting for as far as you're concerned?
The main thing is that what you've just outlined, we should be continuing. One of the things is where small c conservatism is that if the most radical figures on the left come up with completely bizarre new manifestos for what should happen, like the complete forgetting of biology or anything else. If they come up with that, it's true that others could resist that and say, no, we have an alternative utopian vision and so on. I myself not a devotee of that idea. I'm a devotee of the idea of returning to the sane and the normal and the pursuit of the beautiful and the true. Now, those are all things which you don't have to invent a whole new paradigm for. We have it in the civilization you just described, in the institutions, in the buildings, in the works of art, and much more. It's what I mean, think of it this way. What if instead of everybody in our age who has any intelligence being told that they should use it to problematize history and go over history, focus on things that were solved and try to unsolve them and make the situation worse? What if instead of that, people actually wanted to make history? What if instead of being figures who could make the past worse and approach it with greater lack of nuance than ever before, they decided to become historic figures themselves? Well, that would be something to aim for. What if instead of seeing the dozen or so figures that stand over the courtyard at Columbia University, Dante, Aristotle, and so on, what if instead of viewing them as simply dead white men, you viewed them as part of a tradition that you can be a part of and add to? Well, that would be something. And I think it's a very good vision for life. And I think it did our forebears well. And if you have a pride in that tradition, which certainly in Europe we have the right to, not to eradicate any dark times, goodness knows, but a right to have that tradition and to want to add to it and to want to preserve it and keep it going, that seems to me a pretty good basis for life. And remembering things that everyone knew until yesterday.
And I wonder, is it pride or is it grateful aspiration to? You know, because that word pride, that's been a very thorny word, you might say, and increasingly so in recent years. It's like, well, the right attitude to have towards the great figures of the past. I mean, in this Peterson Academy that we just launched, we have one of the members of the House of Lords do a lecture series on 7 great historical leaders of the past. I'm kind of rubbing my hands together about that course, because it's not the sort of course that you could get at a university, all things considered. There were no great men. They were just pursuing their own power dynamic for their own narrow, self-serving purposes.
Which is it's so preposterous. I mean, you just, I was with some mutual friends of ours recently on the island of St. Helena. And although I tend to take the British view about Napoleon, which was that he was a proto-tyrant, you cannot sit in Napoleon's study in Longwood House looking out at the ocean and considering the battalions of the British Army that had to stay on the island to keep the emperor inside, and the fleet of British boats that had to sit in the harbor facing inwards to make sure the emperor didn't escape, to just think, wow, this was a world historical force, this man. You're able to take the bad with the good sometimes. And, but goodness me, I mean, the idea that there were no great men in history, or that it's all just sort of relative, is so preposterous. And you don't have to go to a sort of Carlylean great man theory. But by the way, that's a much better theory of history than anything that's being pushed on us at the moment. I mean, I don't want to ramble, but I mean, there's a case that I was saying, actually, I did an alternative commencement speech for some of the students at Columbia the other month, because they weren't allowed a commencement ceremony because of the protesters at their university. And of course, so a nice group of students and their families asked if I would speak, and I did as much as I could. And but one of the things, I said, as well as talking about the famous great figures of the past, I gave the example of there's a 16-year-old who Andrew Roberts mentions in his History of World War II, The Storm of War. The 16-year-old who lied about his age to get into the British Navy as a submariner in 1940 or so, is on one of the submarines that sinks a German U-boat. They get the crew off the boat, and it's sinking. But this 16-year-old and a couple of the others get into this German U-boat as it's sinking, find, among other things, one of the encryption devices, which is sent back to Bletchley Park and which allows the Allies to crack the Enigma code. That 16-year-old ended up being, as it happened, he was chucked out of the Navy because he'd lied about his age. But that 16-year-old boy called Tommy changed the course of human history for the good. Now, tell me it wouldn't be better as a society, instead of telling people to wallow in grievance and anger and bitterness, to say, it actually doesn't matter where you come from. If you have it in you, you could be a world historical figure as well and improve things demonstrably for the better with your life.
I suppose one of the conclusions that you could draw would be that the provision of ideologies that claim the contrary are generated for no other reason than to alleviate the responsibility for doing so from the shoulders, to lift the burden of responsibility for doing so from the shoulders of the authors of those ideologies. Everything is pointless. All morality is relative. No one's life has any true significance. I can do whatever the hell I want with whoever the hell I want to, with no consequences whatsoever, because in the final analysis, does it really matter? It's like, well, does it really matter? Well, the reason I concluded eventually that it did really matter was because that's the pathway to hell. And it looks to me like even if heaven doesn't exist, hell matters. And you'll figure that out when you get there. And it sounds to me like what you're doing with your new tour is bringing an expanded vision of the hell that awaits us if we don't walk a little bit more carefully than we have been.
And the heroism that can await you too. That's, I will get into this more, but I mean, that is one of the things that I find extraordinary from my past year. I've seen it before, but wow, until you see what people are able to do under unbelievable circumstances and to risk their lives and sometimes to give their lives for a common good, for a purpose, for a cause, sacrificially, almost self-sacrificially. I'm thinking of people who drove right into the fire on the 7th and were citizens and who stood up for their neighbor and saved a lot of people. And people often think heroism is, sort of a thing from the past. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. It's something that if the time emerges, you would hope you'll be able to raise yourself to. But I've seen many people who did.
Well, that's the purpose of education, is to prepare yourself for precisely that. I mean, you saw, when you came on tour with me, you saw the lights go on in the crowd, let's say, when a case was being made for the relationship between truth and responsibility and adventure and meaning. It's like this call to take your place at the feet of the greats, let's say. That's not some cliche. And it's so interesting to watch people's response to the representation of that pathway, because so many people are so seriously demoralized. It's like, no, you could gird your loins, so to speak, and become something. And you have a cardinal role to play, and you'd find the meaning of your life in doing that. And that meaning is more real than anything else, because it actually is the medication that you can take that doesn't precisely make you immune to pain, but it makes you able to accept it without becoming bitter and murderous. And that's not nothing.
Well,
right.
I mean, it has to be that there is an answer to demoralization, and that is something like remoralization of people, a reminder of people to rise to their better instincts, to rise to their better pasts, to aspire to their better forebears. That's all possible. There's no reason that radicals on any side should have to drag us down into this pit. Absolutely no reason. And we should be able collectively to cut whatever rope it is that they are trying to link us to and pull us down on, and saying, no, you can go that way, but you're not taking me with you.